Pasadena Press. The city clerk's office received 8 letters expressing support and providing comments regarding the proposed zoning code amendments to the city's cannabis regulations. That the proposed changes will create competitive, viable legal market, bring jobs, additional tax revenue for the city, and other benefits, and urging the city council to approve the code amendments. 3 letters were received in opposition to and/or expressing concerns regarding the proposed action, stating the need to keep the 1 dispensary per district and 1,000-foot separation requirement to prevent overconcentration of cannabis retailers and protect residential neighborhoods, that the proposal is inequitable to the people of Pasadena and to all licensed and pending cannabis retailers in the city, and that the proposed amendment would violate state law and invalidate the voters' intent. And 1 letter stating concerns regarding one of the licensed cannabis retailers, and they named Harvest of Pasadena in their concerns. The correspondence was distributed to the city council, posted online, and is part of this public hearing record. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Again, this is this comes through us through EdTech. But before we get to the committee chair, why don't we have the city manager open it?
Thank you, Mayor and council members. We do have a brief staff presentation, but just as a prelude to that, the city voters in November 2016 approved our Measure CC and related tax measure item DD. Measure CC envisioned that we would have up to 6 cannabis retailers initially. We went through a very rigorous process, receiving over 100 applications. Ultimately, we selected 6 that were determined to be the best proposals, and they sent off to identify locations that met our very stringent zoning requirements, distance separations, and a limit of no more than 1 retail operation per council district. In November of 2019, we provided an update to the council. At that time, really only 3 retailers were able to move forward because of the restrictions, and that's essentially been the case ever since. So it's been nearly 2 years. We have 3 retail operations that have received cannabis permits to operate retail operations. 2 of them are in operation. And so since that time, we've held a couple of discussions with the city council and then more recently with the EdTech committee as to whether the council wishes to consider some modifications to our distance separation requirements and our cap of 1 per council district in order to enable some of the other applicants through the initial round to operate in the city. Also at the EdTech committee, we talked about in the future, should the city council wish to consider new entrants to the marketplace, what a social equity type program might look like. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I think the question on the table for the council today is whether to essentially call to close the process that we've gone under for a couple of years now, or to allow the remaining operators to proceed, and that would require modifying the distance separations and the cap per council district. With that, I'd like to turn it to David Reyes, unless, Mayor, you wanted to hear from the chair of EdTech.
No, let's go forward with the staff presentation, and then we'll turn to the chair of EdTech for some brief comments.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. City council members, I think as the city manager has described, there are a couple of issues that we're going to go through tonight, but really at issue is whether or not we want to change the distance separation requirements from 1,000 feet to 450 feet for in between retailers, and whether or not we want to remove the cap from 1 per council district and allow up to 3. So there are 2 dispensaries that exist in the city that are operating legally. One is Varda on the east end, and one is Essence, sort of midtown. And a third has received a cannabis permit, but is not yet operational, and that's Harvest, and that's on the corner of Pasadena Avenue and Colorado Boulevard. There are 2 other applicants that were deemed worthy to move forward in the process, but have not been able to find a location, and that's Atrium and Sweet Flower. A 7th applicant was disqualified, excuse me, a sixth applicant was disqualified, and that is a MedMen. And there was some discussion about what might happen with the seventh ranked applicant at EdTech, and I'll get into that just a little bit. So tonight, the council may seek to expand the number of permits. Also, excuse me, in the future, we discussed at EdTech the opportunity to expand the number of permits and establish an equity program. Again, that would be for future discussion, and I'll get into that just a little bit as well. So in terms of the background, I think the city manager has described it very well in terms of the legislative history, both at the state level as well as the local level, where there was overwhelming support to legalize cannabis in the city. We recognized early on that there was going to be a problem with the city's distance separation requirements with respect to the total number of applicants that might be able to seek and find a spot. And in November of 2019, we actually came before the city council and requested these same changes. At that time, the council asked us to come back once 3 were operational. And we did come back in April of 2021. And there was a report that was submitted, is attached to this report before you this evening. And at that time, the council decided to table the matter in light of some questions that were raised by Councilmember Kennedy. At the April 19th meeting, rather than hear the item, we received direction from the city council to move to EdTech. And we did present to EdTech on multiple occasions. The first meeting of May 27th, we presented the issues, including potential social equity program, but really focused on potential changes. And at that meeting, the EdTech voted to send staff back with some additional research in terms of identifying potential other alternatives, whether it be from 450 feet maybe to 400 feet or some other number, or remove some other potential barrier to allow additional opportunities within the city. Staff did do that analysis with the city's GIS team. We provided those maps, they're attached here. And because the city's requirements are so restrictive with respect to all the distance separation and all the sensitive uses, it resulted in very little change. And so what we had recommended at the staff level to EdTech was to allow, to remove the city's distance separation requirements and allow the state separation requirements to move forward, so that we would just follow the states. Because in fact, what we've realized with these 2 operators is that they operate very much just like any other retail business. There have been no calls for service, except for one that was actually called by the store operator. And there have been no code enforcement activity at either site. And so they have operated as retailers, and from a land use perspective. And because of that, staff had recommended that we just go as a city with the state's separation requirements. EdTech did not agree. EdTech voted unanimously to change, to pass on a recommendation to pass on to city council that would allow the distance separation between retailers to be changed from 1,000 to 450 feet, and to allow up to 3 retailers in each district. Again, what we've talked about is the city's process resulted in 6 applicants being identified to move forward. Sweet Flower is one of the applicants that cannot find a code compliant location at this time. And Atrium is the other one, and that's numbers 1 and 3 on the list in front of you. Harvest, which is number 2, Varda, which is number 4, and Integral or Essence, which is number 5, have all been issued cannabis permits. The city manager disqualified MedMen, the 6th applicant, from the process due to changes in material changes in ownership, and they were disqualified. These are the locations, just as a reminder. Varda being in CD4, and the green dots represent the open cannabis shops, or the ones that have been permitted. Varda in CD4, Integral in CD7, and then Harvest, which is in CD3, just on the border there of CD6. And the red dots represent the previously proposed locations of the other 3 qualifying applicants: MedMen in CD6, Atrium Group in CD3, and Sweet Flower in CD3. And as discussed previously, although Sweet Flower was one of the top ranked applicants, they've not been able to find a location. We do have what we've found to be the strictest distance separation requirements in the nation. And by design, we don't necessarily always follow the state. We develop rules that are for Pasadena, and it was brand new for us at the time, and we were very concerned that we might be opening up a Pandora's box in terms of potential impacts surrounding uses. And so we developed very strict regulations. That hasn't panned out in terms of the fears that we had, and they've operated very well as good businesses do. And I think that's because of the process we went through to select these businesses. And I think it's important that the council understands that we do have other businesses that have distance separation requirements, drive-throughs, certain alcohol establishments such as bars in areas of the city, tobacco retailers, but none of those have an overall cap like cannabis does. So there's no limit on the number of tobacco retailers that are allowed in the city, no limit on the number of bars, but there is a maximum cap of 6 retail dispensaries in the city. So given the fact that we've identified these 2 operators to be operating as basically good retailers, we do recommend this evening that the ed tech recommendation be carried by the council and the 2 changes to the ordinance be made, and those are listed here. All of the other changes, all of the other distance separation requirements that are in front of you would remain the same. We are just recommending the proposed distance from one retailer to another be changed from 1,000 to 450 feet, and the cap of 1 per council district be from 1 to 3. All of the other requirements that the state doesn't have, we would still keep within the city of Pasadena as recommended this evening. We, again, talked about some other changes that were asked for, that staff was asked to look at. Instead of 450 feet, would 550 feet, would 500 feet do anything? Would some other number? Would removing religious institutions? And really, given the fact that we have so many regulations, it didn't make a lot of sense with respect to, it didn't do anything in terms of opening up additional opportunities. The other issue is that even if they met the distance separation requirements, they may not be available spaces because they're already leased out, or they may be a publicly traded company, and in which case they wouldn't be allowed to have this kind of use there. So that takes care of that issue. That's where the staff recommendation, that's the discussion at EdTech with respect to changes to the ordinance. There's also a cleanup item with respect to labs, and change. There was an error in our code that said 1,000 feet and it should be 500 feet with respect to labs and other uses. There was also discussion about this 7th ranked applicant, which is the local Pasadena-based company that was really 1 point, literally 1 point behind the 6th ranked applicant. And the city manager may move up the 7th ranked applicant and allow them to apply for a CUP, but it wouldn't make a lot of sense if the rules weren't changed. And even if the rules are changed as discussed this evening, that 7th ranked applicant may not be able to find a spot, but it is certainly possible that that could happen. There was discussion at EdTech of a potential equity program, and that would really require expanding the number of permits that we have today, the total of 6, to some other number. And by way of comparison, in terms of based on population, what it looks like in terms of a ratio, what Pasadena is, and you see it with 6, we're at about it's 1 for every 23,000 residents. You compare that to a city like West Hollywood, and it's 1 for every 4,000 residents, and you see on and down the list. And some cities have no limit on that because they just treat it like retail. So that was a discussion that was held in terms of expanding the number of permits. And if council wanted to do that as an equity program, it would be a different scoring criteria. Ours was the previous scoring criteria that exists today is really based on experience and skill and knowledge and past experience operating cannabis dispensaries. We were looking for sort of the best operators. This would be a different program wherein we would look at different criteria, and some of those might be local residency, existing annual income, whether the applicant has been harmed by past drug policies and or regulations. And we'd look at the legality of that with the city attorney's office. Whatever factors that would be considered, obviously there would be more people that were qualified than the number of permits that could be issued. So it would be a very transparent and open process. But again, that would be for future discussion. And that's what EdTech asked us to do, was to change rules today and then come back potentially and look at this equity program in the future. So in terms of next steps, it is staff's recommendation to uphold the EdTech recommendation to change the rules and regulations to allow up to 3 cannabis retailers per district, and to decrease the separation requirements from 1,000 feet to 450 feet, and also to address the error in the distance separation. With that, Mayor, concludes the staff report. We are available to answer questions, myself, Jennifer Page, and the Assistant City Attorney, Ms. Teresa Fuentes.
Thank you, Mr. Reyes. We do have public comment. And before we take public comment, let's have a go around with members of the City Council. This is for asking questions only, and then we can debate after public comment. Let's start with the chair of the committee, as is our practice, Mr. Hampton. Again, this matter went through EdTech. Mr. Hampton is a member of EdTech. Mr. Madison, Mr. Wilson, and Council Member Jess Rivas. Mr. Hampton?
Mayor, I want to make sure that after my
Yes.
colleague speaks that I'm in the queue.
You were first.
If you will. Thank you, Mayor.
I'll be very, did you ask for me to speak, Mayor?
Yes, as chair of the committee.
Okay.
This matter went.
Perfect. I'll be very brief. This matter came to the committee twice. In our last discussion, David summed it up perfectly. We thought that it was appropriate for our program to actually work the way we intended it to work, to make these changes that the staff is presenting today. So the gist of it is the committee voted unanimously to support it and move it to the city council, and that's what we're here today to discuss and talk about. And then also, as far as social equity, we discussed about bringing social equity back because that is something that is important, I think, important to our city, be important to those that were detrimentally impacted by the war on drugs. To bring that back within, I believe it was 18 months, but I was going to ask if it could be 8 months because I think it is something that is needed sooner than later. But that's when we agreed out of committee. Tonight we could have a discussion. So those are my comments from the committee. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. And thank you to my colleagues for giving me the opportunity to chair EdTech.
Thank you, Mr. Hampton. And so this matter comes with the unanimous recommendations of EdTech. Again, before we turn to public comment, we'll take questions from members of the council. Mr. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mayor. I would say at least 90% of the work that our staff does is pretty good work. In this case, staff has failed the council. This whole scheme, regulatory scheme, was devised not by the city council.
Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kennedy, if we can limit it at this point to questions, and then we can come back around and debate and argue the matter. But I'll be sure to turn to you first when that time comes.
Well, I will defer to you as the chair, Mayor, but the problem I'm having is because a proper foundation for my questions would have to be laid because the other members of the council and the public may not have that information or may need to be reminded of what actually took place. Without that foundation, I'm left in the council's left.
Okay, I get it.
Left.
Go ahead.
Wait, please allow me to finish,
Yeah,
Mayor.
go ahead.
Is left with a incomplete.
John, I'm agreeing with you. Mr. Kennedy, I'm trying. So go ahead and continue.
I just want, no, I have to be respectful of the chair because you have to manage the meeting. But I want to know, Mayor, how do I get out sharing what I believe is shoddy staff work without making my comments?
No, you just did. But go ahead and continue.
No, but I'm not providing,
No, go ahead and, I'm saying, I'm reversing myself,
okay, Mayor.
Mr. Kennedy. I
Mayor and colleagues, we are here today because nothing less than shoddy staff work. The question of 1,000 square feet or 400 square feet or linear feet, that recommendation came from staff as it relates to placing more than or up to 3 cannabis retailers in any one district. This is a discussion that we fully had at the council level and with the community. It is the expectation that there'd be no more than 1 cannabis retailer, at least for the first iteration, in one district. How it is written now, Mayor and colleagues, you would essentially allow 3 cannabis operations in District 3. I would suggest that there is strong evidence, Mayor and colleagues, that there is only one place where, even with the possibility of revising the requirements, where you could place this cannabis. The whole issue of the legalization of cannabis is not the issue here. The issue is a regulatory scheme that is violative of what you shared with the city of Pasadena voters. So my first question, and by the way, when we have something as serious as this matter to discuss and staff is sharing slides, I would request that you, without exception, number the slides so any one council member or the mayor would be able to refer to the slide on the screen by number as opposed to the recollection of the information that's provided. So can I have an agreement from the city manager that that will occur and that what happened just a short time ago will not happen again?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Look, cannabis provides, according to medical evidence, real benefit. So that's not even an issue. The issue is the concentration in the most diverse district in the city of Pasadena that has the most public housing developments in the city, and the fact that in the 1980s, there was wholesale arrest, criminalization of people who grew up in the same district that Councilmember Gordo and I grew up in, or areas that Councilmember Gordo and Mayor Gordo and I frequented as kids and adults. We can't truly have this discussion, in my view, unless we deal with the California Cannabis Equity Act of 2018. There is no real discussion about that law. That law helps councils like ours make it through the process and recognize that a group were disproportionately focused upon by law enforcement for surveillance, for arrest, for prosecution, and then there's no social equity piece. Fundamentally, Mayor and colleagues, we couldn't have that discussion because our city manager would refuse to even put that on the table for consideration. He refused. He refused to allow local operators to participate because he was concerned of the criminality aspect of folks who were possibly once upon a time engaged in the illegal sale of cannabis. Now, we are here today and we're not even discussing social equity, but you're willing to put into law a possibility of putting 3 cannabis retail operations in District 3 without any social equity, it's discriminatory. It's a discriminatory intent because the city manager said to all of us what his intent was before it was even discussed at the city council. It's a discriminatory result because no African Americans, to the best of my knowledge, no Latinos, to the best of my knowledge, are recipients of licenses or in the queue to receive a license. Yes, I have a problem with that. And every member of the city council needs to have a problem with that. And for those of you who may say they can't do it, that's baloney, because in other jurisdictions, including Los Angeles, up and down the state, formerly incarcerated young men and women have been provided licenses to have retail operation businesses in cannabis. One of them is Baller, where one brother had no record whatsoever, and the other brother has a felony on his record. He has a felony on his record, but the law allows him, after he's paid his debt to society, to participate in this business. Now, when we were talking about, not us personally, but when our country once upon a time was talking about liquor, illegality of liquor, prohibition, those weren't Black people involved, those weren't Latinos involved, those were white people who were saying it needs to be legalized. So don't give me this excuse about being concerned about smaller operators having the possibility of illegal activity. We had a clean process. The clean process just didn't involve Pasadena folks, didn't involve Latino folks, didn't involve African Americans. There's something wrong with that, Mayor Gordo. There's something wrong with that, my colleagues. There's something wrong with that. And now you'd have the audacity to put forth essentially the same agenda report and recommendations that existed on the previous time the whole council considered this matter. I find that reprehensible. I find that disrespectful, Steve Ramel. I find that it's disrespectful to me personally as a council member who represents a heavily minority district that were overly policed because of drugs and specifically the use of cannabis. I am asking my colleagues who I have personally supported and publicly supported when matters have been in your district and you were fighting for the life and fairness of your district, that you consider strongly my comments. I'm serious about this matter because it's a fairness matter and discriminatory intent at the beginning, discriminatory results. And the last thing in this iteration, Mayor, I'd like to share. The question was, do we have this cannabis retailer who's provided a license, who's still the same licensee when that license was granted? The city manager knows full well that that particular license was sold in a corporate buyout by a very large corporation into the hundreds of millions. But that's not for discussion today, is it? No, but it needs to be discussed because someone said that a corporation of this magnitude could not even participate. I don't know that to be true. I haven't researched that, but it certainly needs to be disclosed that one of the licensees has sold their business where we allowed them to have a license. Mayor, on this issue, Mayor, I would ask a lot of deference, and for the moment, I have not much more to say at this iteration. And I thank you, Mayor, and I mean this sincerely, for allowing me to share my comments. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Councilmember Williams, I'm sorry, Masuda, followed by Ms. Williams.
Mayor, I think Councilmember Williams was before me, so would you
Okay.
have her go?
Oh,
before
did I
me?
get it backwards? You're right. I see the queue here. Councilmember Williams, followed by Mr. Masuda. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Masuda, and also thank you, Councilmember Kennedy, for your comments. I really take them to heart. So I have some questions that kind of do get at the issues that Councilmember Kennedy has brought up. And they are kind of technical questions that will help me get to a decision here tonight. But the staff kind of dodged me on the question of revenues, and I kind of get it, but I'm going to ask the question again, and I'll ask it this way. For the two operators, we had a projection of $1 to $2 million a year for measured DD, the excise tax on cannabis. The current operators, are they below, at, or above our projections? Since you wouldn't answer the question of what their revenues were.
Councilmember Williams, the estimate of somewhere between $1 and $2 million a year was based on having 6 retail operators. Since only 2 are in operation, the revenues are a fraction of that estimate.
So you're not going to give me an over or under?
Well, the challenge is sales tax information is confidential. And at one point in time, for at least, I think, a 3-month period, perhaps longer, we only had 1 operator. I hesitate to disclose particular dollar amounts because it may be very simple to discern what a particular operator generated. I would say that on a per operator basis, and we anticipated that they would bring in about $140,000 a year in tax revenue under DD. I would say, based on some information I've seen, one's doing a lot better and one's doing about expectations. But I don't want to go any further than that because I don't want to violate any confidentiality. It's proprietary.
Okay, so I'll come to the conclusion that the fiscal impact is undetermined. The second question is, with reference to harvest, has a change of control evaluation been done on the harvest permit? And then would the harvest permit you said was granted, the actual cannabis permit was granted in February. So does that give them, with a 1-year extension, does that give them until February 2023 to open their location in Old Pasadena?
If we can identify the location just so that the public understands.
Councilmember Williams, you're talking about Harvest that received a cannabis permit, correct? And would be at the location of Pasadena Avenue and Colorado Boulevard?
Yes.
I think it's probably best to turn to either Michelle Bonaris, the city attorney, or Teresa Fuentes to give an answer as it relates to reviewing any claims in regard to changes of control. I will say that we are reviewing any claims made, but that's not the subject matter of tonight's public hearing. But I would defer to the city attorney if they wanted to add any more to that.
And just for clarification, while we look to the city attorney, that location was previously approved. What year?
The cannabis,
2019.
2019. Thank you. And has not opened.
that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember, I'll answer by saying that change in control is the rubric by which we analyzed a change prior to the issuance of a cannabis permit. Harvest has its cannabis permit, so change of control is not the applicable standard. It's a change in ownership. And we do not have information yet to support a change of ownership yet, as far as I am aware.
Okay, if we could get an update on that at some later point, whether there was a change of control prior to February or after February, because we had heard, remember, we'd heard conjecture that there was a change of control last year. So just sort of an update on that would be good at the council. And then probably David Reyes, maybe what is the final date that they would have to open with their cannabis permit? With the extension?
So To have the code requires that they have these 6 operators or whoever it might be, have a cannabis permit in hand by January 5th, 2022.
Okay, so that wasn't the question.
I'm sorry.
Harvest got their cannabis permit February 17th, 2021.
Correct.
How long do they have to open with their permit?
So the code doesn't have that time frame within it. What the code does have is an annual review of each cannabis permit. And so 1 year from the date of issuance of the cannabis permit, we would review each one of those and make a determination about whether the cannabis permit should be renewed or not. I don't want to make conjecture about what might happen if they don't open, but we would have all options available to us, including revocation of that permit.
Okay, and so your answer to me was if they do not open before 1 year, it is possible that the permit could be revoked.
It is
And
possible.
then my follow-up question was, would Sweet Flower or Atrium then be able to apply for a CUP and cannabis permit in District 3 if Harvest permit is revoked or they don't open?
And the issue with that would be one of timing, number one. Number two, I guess the short answer is that would be, if that permit was revoked, that would be an eligible site.
And
Councilmember Williams, can I just ask a follow-up question on that?
yeah.
Before you proceed. So my understanding on conditional use permits, and I'll look to staff and the city attorney to clarify, but my understanding on conditional use permits is if they aren't utilized for a certain period of time, my recollection is 6 months, but it could be a year, that they then extinguish, and anyone looking to utilize that, they're deemed to be discontinued and no longer available to the applicant of the conditional use permit for use. Am I wrong on that?
You're not wrong, Mayor. It is 12 months within our code. You have 12 months within which to utilize that permit.
A conditional use permit.
A conditional use permit, not the cannabis permit. So the scheme that we set up requires the cannabis permit, the CUP, business tax, and then the state's cannabis license. But the CUP is critical to all of that. If you don't have the CUP, then you cannot operate.
But does this involve a conditional use permit?
It does, Mayor.
And so I think that's the question that Councilmember Williams is driving at, and we should have some research.
Yeah, 12. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mayor. It would be 12 months from the date of the issuance of that of the CUP, and we will have that.
Yeah.
We can pull that together for you.
Now, the other thing that, I mean, it may not just be our own code, but my recollection again is that it's governed by state law. And so we should look very carefully at state law. I don't know that to be true, but that's my recollection when we dealt with liquor stores in the past. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Williams.
Thank you, Mayor. So what I'm driving at is there's kind of a certain end date that we're coming to here of the current cannabis applications. And so that's what I'm trying to get at. If the CUP was granted, and I voted on that on the Planning Commission in 2019, they received their cannabis permit within the time frame in February, and they have 1 year and then a 1 year extension. I put that at February 2023 is the sort of end date by when they need to open. So as I look at this, if they don't open by February 2023, then Atrium or Sweet Flower has the ability to then go into District 3 because there no longer would be an entity in District 3. So that's what I'm trying to triangulate to. I'm going to use that as my assumption just based on the information. It's probably a little bit different, but
Councilmember Williams,
yeah.
if I may, just to jump in, this is Steve.
Mhm.
I agree with what you're saying in terms of the timeline staff's confirming the dates, but I would also point out that in my view, the council needs to make a decision sort of one way or the other. I don't think we can just hold the Sweet Flower and Atrium's applications in perpetuity. Either we we say our process has run its course and we stop where we're at, or we make some adjustments as Ed Tech is recommending and we place a couple more, and then has been suggested by Councilmember Hampton at some time in the future, we actually consider whether another round would be in order and whether that should have a greater social equity component. So I say all that just to say, I agree generally with what you're saying, but I don't think we want to say that the next up, whenever that is, even if it's 2 years from now, is Atrium and Sweet Flower. I think the council needs to decide, are we standing pat with the 3 or allowing more than 3? And if the answer is standing pat, then we've completed our process, and any future process should be a new process to be fair to all applicants.
Yeah, I hear you, Steve, and I have made my decision based on that. So,
Yeah.
So you'll get what you asked for. So, and then the other question is, could Sweet Flower or Atrium right now, because we extend the deadline, couldn't they just find another location that isn't in District 3?
If there's a viable location in District 6, they certainly could. Under existing rules, they can find one. It seems that there are challenges and issues with that, but the answer is yes, they absolutely can. They're free to look.
Well, District 6 or District 2, I don't think I have one.
Correct. Yeah, if there's a viable location, they certainly could.
Yeah, some nice sites over by the Home Depot. And then the last question is, Councilmember Kennedy brought this up, but I'm not familiar with any other section of the zoning code that has less than a 500-foot separation between uses. So why the 450 feet? And is that an anomaly in the code?
Yeah. So bars and nightclubs in the 81 are 250 feet in terms of distance separation. Large family daycare is 300 feet. And again, most of these don't necessarily have a distance separation from the same use. 250 feet for sexually oriented businesses, and then 300 feet for emergency shelters. So absolutely that exists. There is no set standard. Some are 1,000 feet, some are 250, some are 500. We came up arbitrarily with the distance separation that we did. Again, the state didn't have it, and so I don't think that 450 feet is inconsistent with other distance separations in the city.
Okay, but would it have to be 450 feet? It couldn't be 500?
It could be whatever the council wants to decide.
Okay, those are my questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Masuda was next.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I want to let you know that I feel Councilmember Kennedy's frustration. And as you remember, those of us that were on council then, we had a long discussion about cannabis businesses. And if you remember, I was the holdout for having only one per district, or I wasn't going to vote for this thing, or for this cannabis issue to go to the voters. So what I don't understand today is, why are we talking about increasing the cap of 1 to 3 cannabis stores instead of focusing on the distance requirement? I think we have this, that's where we should be talking about. I'm not saying that that's something that I will support this today, but I'd like to have that discussion because I'm a little bit more flexible there than increasing the cap. So that's my question, Mr. Reyes. Why are we talking about increasing the cap instead of focusing on the distance requirement?
We're looking at both, Councilmember Masuda. So we're looking at both distance being reduced from 1,000 to 450 feet, but we're also looking at sort of the arbitrary boundaries that are the council districts, and we know those are going to change. And so what we've identified with respect to the 2 outstanding operators or potential operators is that the proposal in front of the council this evening would allow those two to land, and we can conclude this sort of phase of permitting, and we would have potentially 5 operators within the city.
Thank you, and I look forward to hearing this discussion as time goes on after we get the public to make comments. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I know this was thoroughly discussed at the committee by Mr. Wilson, Mr. Madison, Councilmember Rivas, and Mr. Hampton, but I do have a couple of questions. I want to ask, so state law has no distance separation for any cannabis?
That's correct. They're treated just as retailers.
Okay, and the 250 feet separation for alcohol, that applies citywide? My recollection, I remember when we adopted that, well, not we, but I remember when that was adopted in the early 90s, the overlay district, late 80s or early 90s is my recollection. And I remember those debates, and that's 250 feet for Old Pasadena only, correct?
That's correct, Mayor. There was absolute concern of overconcentration, and some reports I read was the fear of it turning into a Westwood. And so it's for the Old Pasadena area. And there's 1,000 foot in 82, which is a larger area within CD6.
Okay. And so to Council Member Masuda's point, the only thing that we're looking at here is the distance requirements. We're not looking at increasing the cap citywide. In other words, what was it, 5 or 6?
Maximum up to 6.
Up to 6 citywide. That's not impacted whatsoever.
That's correct. That's not on the table this evening. That would be maybe future discussion if the council wanted to have an equity program. We'd probably need to have some more permitting.
And people have asked
Mayor,
me.
clarification.
Yes, Mr. Kennedy?
Mayor, it's my belief that Councilmember Masuda was referencing that possible increase.
No, I understand.
But for the record, I want everyone else who's listening, 1 to 3 in any one council member's district, when the voters all believed that they were saying no more than 1 per councilmatic district, or up to 1 per councilmatic district. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. And one of the things that, and I was chair of EdTech and a member of the committee at the time that we developed these guidelines, or what ultimately ended up in the ordinance. And one of the things that was very important to me is the yearly review of cannabis operators. Can you just talk a little bit about that, Mr. Reyes?
Yes.
My brain's a little
Absolutely, Mayor.
foggy on that issue. How does that work?
So it's a formal review. It's required annually. And what we've been doing is we've been sending code enforcement staff out twice a month to these operators to review with them all of the rules that they need to follow, the rules of their conditional use permit, as well as all of the standards. We show up unannounced. We look at some of their inventory. We track it back to state, basically like a seed to sale review, to ensure that they're up to speed with respect to all of their regulatory requirements. And then we've given them a 12-page matrix of things that we're looking at. So while it's an annual review, there will be no surprises. We're reviewing every code requirement, every conditional use permit standard twice a month with each one of the 2 that are operating. And I think that's the benefit of being a medium-sized city and only having a maximum of up to 5, where we can send code staff out, get to know these operators, and ensure that they are complying within the rules and regulations, which is why I do believe there have been no calls for service to the police department with either operator. There have been no code compliance complaints from either operator. There was 1 call made by 1 operator with respect to an issue. It's some a homeless issue is my understanding, and that's the only call for service.
Thank you. And as part of that yearly review, the a use permit could be revoked, shutting down. That is within the discretion of the review.
That's correct. The city's discretion would be potentially to revoke a cannabis permit if they were not following rules.
Okay. And this is for the city manager. One of the, the policy underpinning the ordinance at the time that it was developed at EdTech and brought to the council was to put in place regulation that would then discourage street sales, illegal, unregulated sales. Have we seen a decline in street level sales and arrests?
Thank you, Mayor. And speaking with the Deputy Police Chief, she reported to me this afternoon that we have seen some diminution in street level sales. And so whether you can draw the connection that say that having two retail operators are having a positive result in that, I'm not sure if we can make that casual link, but there is a report of a diminution.
The other public policy underpinning the ordinance at the time was that we were concerned that the city would lose control and that there would be a group of individuals who continued to operate, or that a group of individuals would bring forth an initiative that would then open it up to more stores, whether it's 3 in one neighborhood or 3 in one district or 200 within the city. We don't know, obviously, but was that weighed by the committee? And I'll look to members of the committee. Is that an issue that staff continues to be concerned about?
I might start, Mayor, just to remind the city council that at the time we developed the ordinance, we had over 20 illegal operators in the city, and then a few more that were on the fringes. And we worked very hard to basically to get rid of them. And it was a joint effort between the city attorney's office, the city prosecutor, and my department from the code enforcement standpoint. And it took about 1.5 years to do that. And to this day, I would like to report that there are no illegal operators in the city today. And I think it would have been hard for us to say, we're going to shut down all the illegal operators and not open up the legal shops. And I think that was a discussion that was had in a policy effort to say, okay, we want to allow this to be legalized. At the same time, we want to make sure that there's no illegal operators in the city. And I think we've done a very, very good job. Other jurisdictions in the county, they continue to struggle. I think we're struggling on the permitting side, but we've done a very good job with the illegal operators to date, Mayor.
So our regulation, in fact, our effort to regulate the businesses has worked. And I have to say that when I, in the past, visited, not in this city, but together with a group, one of the unlicensed places, it was pretty, it was pretty interesting to see. It was more like a lounge. It was more of it wasn't just retail sales, but people were actually using within the facility, including, I believe, some of the employees. It was pretty obvious that it was unregulated. And I think that some cities still struggle with those unregulated businesses, is what I'm told as I talk to some of my colleagues throughout the county and in other counties. So that has worked. And that was a matter that was debated and discussed by the committee. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mayor.
Or that is? Okay. So, Mr. Kennedy appropriately makes a very impassioned argument about district boundaries. And the action we're taking is a 450-foot separation, correct?
That's correct, Mayor.
And so if I have it correct, Mr. Kennedy's concern is a store would open in somewhere somewhere in the lake area, in the center part of the city. And then one in Old Pasadena at Union Street near DeLacy, and then the one that's already been approved, if it ever opens. And I would suggest that we look carefully at the law out there at Colorado and then Pasadena. Correct? And so,
That's correct.
the final question is, when this matter came to EdTech, we looked very carefully at protecting sensitive uses. We looked very carefully at protecting churches, neighborhoods, hospital uses, I think, were included. There was a whole slew of sensitive childcare centers that were to be protected. Does this staff proposal in any way affect those the distance requirement of 1,000 feet from sensitive uses like a neighborhood?
That's correct, Mayor. No other changes are proposed to any other sensitive uses, including mixed use projects are not allowed at the ground floor of mixed use projects. They're not allowed within 600 feet of residential zones,
Oh, so-
600 feet of parks. Those all remain in place.
And so the original separation, I'm sorry, I said 1,000, but I think it was it 600?
600.
Okay, so those original separation requirements remain in place
That's correct,
and
Mayor.
will not be affected whatsoever by staff.
That was not any change. That was not recommended by EdTech. No other changes.
Okay. Okay, I think that's it for me for the moment in terms of questions. Any other member of the council or member of the committee want to clarify or ask questions? Mr. Madison?
Mayor, I wonder if staff could put up a map of the locations that we're talking about, because I certainly was very eloquent and sincere in his concerns, but I also feel like this hewing to districts was something that, perhaps wasn't really realistic when we started it. It's pretty clear, we're going through redistricting right now. That's one problem with using council district as any sort of metric, is those districts are going to change. And I think I said at the committee, nobody drives around Pasadena saying to themselves, I'm leaving District 2 and now entering District 5. Now I'm turning south into District 7. I mean, these are frankly somewhat artificial political barriers that we use to ensure equal representation for our residents. What the data is showing us here very vividly is that the community of interest for a retailer in the cannabis business is along Colorado Boulevard, period. I mean, there are some business districts here that capital is attracted to. It's not really in what we traditionally think of as neighborhoods. And I certainly don't want to make my constituents who live in the central part of the city upset by that. But, if you look at this visual with the one down in the bottom there having fallen out because of the change in ownership, everybody that we're talking about is concentrated along the corridor of Colorado. And so I think it's not helpful to think about, the policing or, experiences with affordable housing or the affliction of drugs or crime and all, given that what we're seeing right here. And I think staff has done a tremendous job. I'm really disheartened to hear the kind of scathing attacks on staff. Staff's done a really good job to try to assess the situation as it's gone forward and figure out what's best for Pasadena. And I just want to say, I voted against marijuana. I don't think it's good public policy to legalize cannabis. I'd vote no. I wouldn't have any of it. But the voters decided that we should. And, this presents, tax revenue for the city and And presumptively, we're meeting a need of the residents who strongly supported this public policy. So, I intend at the appropriate time, subject to the public comment that we haven't heard yet, to be consistent with what we did at EdTech, which is move forward with this plan. I know that's not as much of a question, Mayor, but we sort of strayed from that about an hour ago. So thank you.
I agree. Okay, anyone else? Why don't we go to public comment?
We have 5 speakers on this item. Douglas Smurr, followed by Paddle Aposhian, followed by Dave Barmore. So let's bring in Douglas Smurr. Mr. Smurr, if you would unmute your, there you go. And you can start public comment.
All right, thank you, and good afternoon, Mayor and council members. My name is Douglas Smurr. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Gordon and Reese, and I represent Harvest of Pasadena. My comments are going to be brief. I'm just going to mention 2 items. One, which was item number 3 in the correspondence I submitted this morning, which talks about the options available to the city. And my suggestion to the mayor and the council members this afternoon is that the city manager, Mr. Merrill, and David Reyes have it backwards. I believe that the best thing to do would be to continue and uphold the ordinances that have been in place as far as in regards to limiting the cannabis dispensaries to 1 per district and keeping the 1,000 feet requirement, and putting all of the other restrictions based on the state guidelines. If you do that, and if you take a look at my exhibit number 2, it opens up a huge amount of properties that could be viable for cannabis dispensaries in council districts 1, 2, and 5. And that would, number 1, prevent overconcentration of the cannabis dispensaries in the city of Pasadena, which we have heard a lot of this evening. And it will also keep and respect the voters' intent, which was to do 2 things. Number 1, have the 1 cannabis dispensary per council district, and to avoid overconcentration. The second comment I would make would be
40 seconds.
Is that if the council approves this, then it's going to be inviting a huge new and opening a Pandora box of new round of litigation that's going to continue and freeze everything for another 2.5 years. Currently, there are only 2 litigations remaining, and they will wind up within 6 months. So it's important for the council to understand what is before it. Thank you.
You know, I thank you, Mr. Swift. Before we move on, I'd like a response from, I think we strengthened the state's law, creating more distance requirement for sensitive uses. If I followed the speaker, he's arguing we go with state separation requirements, and that would significantly weaken our ordinance. I for one would not support that, but
Yeah, our ordinance, even with the proposed changes, goes so much further than the state and any other jurisdiction that we could find. So I'm not sure exactly what the statement is in reference to. But our ordinance strengthens the states by adding at least 9 other sensitive uses from which a dispensary needs to be away from. And the state only has a maximum, it's just 3. The state says you need to be 600 feet from a school, 600 feet from a youth center, and 600 feet from a daycare center, and that is it.
And we included 9 other categories of sensitive uses.
11.
11, thank you. Okay, next speaker.
Patil Aposhian, followed by Dave Barmore, followed by Wesley Tyner. Patil, if you could *6 the phone that you're on, press *6 to unmute. There you go. Can you let us know if you're there?
Hello.
There you go.
Yes,
Go ahead. Your time is starting now.
thank you. The recommendation in front of you today is in the best interest for the city of Pasadena for tax revenue, more jobs, and future social equity opportunities. We have exhausted multiple resources and efforts to reach this point, including thorough research and review by city staff and ed tech. There are no viable spaces in District 2 or 6. Multiple scenarios and maps have been presented time and again from city staff. The only scenario that works is what the city staff and ed tech agreed to and recommend. With this recommendation, we are not increasing the cap. It is still capped at 6. We are not concentrating dispensaries in one area. We are not supporting or giving opportunity to illegal operators. And as important, we will continue to protect the sensitive use locations that the city and voters find relevant and important. Please vote in favor of today's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave Barmore, followed by Wesley Tyner, followed by Tim Dodd. Mr. Barmore, if you could unmute, I can start your time when you're ready.
Good afternoon, Mayor and city council members.
Good afternoon.
My name
Go
is
ahead.
Dave Barmore. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
My name is Dave Barmore and I lead public affairs for MedMen. We strongly oppose this attempt to amend the city's existing cannabis ordinance as we feel it is inequitable to the people of Pasadena and all licensed and pending cannabis retailers in the city. It is also contrary to the intent of Measure CC, which promised to avoid any concentration of retailers in one area. It would be especially prejudicial to MedMen and would upend the status quo in MedMen's pending licensing litigation against the city. As you've heard from multiple council members tonight, we believe the city should finish the current licensing process under the current set of rules. The current recommendation is vocally supported by one retailer, Sweet Flower, who has not been able to secure a lease or CUP for a compliant location under the existing ordinance. As you know, we were selected as one of the 6 top scoring applicants in the city selection process, secured a compliant location in Council District 6, and completed all application requirements for the CUP land use approval. On the evening of our CUP hearing, the city started a process to revoke our selection based on the false allegations of this retailer and competitor, Sweet Flower. That competitor still has no compliant approved location and appears to continue to try to bend the rules, including supporting an amendment to allow it to move forward in districts already secured by other retailers. We encourage residents of Pasadena to ask questions as to why the city is considering this amendment to solely accommodate Sweet Flower. We are also concerned that adoption of this proposal would allow a competitor to secure a location and a CUP in Council District 6, while MedMen's litigation against the city remains pending. This would be highly prejudicial to MedMen, upsetting the status quo and contrary to the rules in place at the time of selection, possibly requiring injunctive relief against the city or further litigation against the amendment itself. We urge you to vote down this proposal and continue with the process as originally approved by the voters and relied upon by the retail applicant. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Wesley Tyner, followed by Tim Dodd. Mr. Tyner, could you unmute? Okay. Are you there?
Hello. Hello,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Wesley Tyner. I've been a resident of Pasadena for all. I'm speaking tonight to encourage the Pasadena City Council to work with MedMen and bring them back into the licensing process. I think that the entire process has been marred, and the last thing I want to do is shop somewhere that could be raided by authorities that the current number of cannabis retailers does not create the kind of competition that brings prices down and pushes quality up. Oftentimes, the armed security guards at other stores make me feel uncomfortable, and MedMen is the only company that allows me to purchase cannabis like I would any other herb or produce from the grocery store. Cannabis helps me manage anxiety, and dealing with LA traffic to go downtown is an unnecessary stress inducer, but the only way for me to reach the retailers with the best products. The people of Pasadena voted to invite cannabis dispensaries to do business, and the city has marred that process to fulfill the obligation. As a proud customer of MedMen, I implore you to bring their quality service to our city as soon as possible. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And the last public comment speaker on this item is Tim Dodd. Mr. Dodd, please unmute.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you. I have three very quick points. My name is Tim Dodd. I'm the CEO of Sweet Flower. Firstly, we support the narrow and tailored changes recommended by EdTech that will get all qualified operators in and create the foundation for a viable and legal market, enhancing competition and creating a viable alternative to the illegal market. Most importantly, these changes do not impact any actual sensitive receptors. They do not reduce the distances to churches, schools, parks, libraries, and any of the other actual sensitive receptors that the ordinance so wisely requires distance from. The only effect is to enhance competition between operators in bringing to light in Pasadena a fully functioning and viable cannabis business. We are a small local business. We're not a billionaire boys club. We support social equity in Pasadena. We are ready to assist and support social equity in any way. In Los Angeles, we are already training at the request of the LADCR and the LA Cannabis Commission a number of social equity licensees, and we're happy to do the same in Pasadena. Our MOU with the Pasadena Community Coalition is already well documented, has been acted on. This morning, we were proud to announce our collaboration with Octavius, Master of Buds, a Pasadena African-American owned equity brand. We have looked over the last 2.5 years at over 1,800 alternative properties to the location we currently have and have been paying rent on since June 2019. We have looked in districts 1, 2, 5, and 6. These districts, 1, 2, and 5 in particular, are notable by their distance to residences, churches, and schools.
1 minute.
If those areas were to become open, the city would have to change the distance separation to residences, churches, and schools to 150 feet. That includes the Home Depot, that includes many of the other supermarkets and other commercial areas in a 1, 2, and 5. We do not support that change that will bring cannabis dispensaries too close to those actual sensitive receptors. The change that we support is to enhance competition, to open up districts 3 and others to more dispensaries in the commercial zones, and to protect Pasadena's precious residences, schools, and churches. And lastly, these are renewable licenses. They are not renewed by right. The city should review every operator every year and hold all of us accountable to ensure that we are doing what we said we would do for this great city. Thank you.
Thank you. That completes public comment on this public hearing.
Thank you. With that, circling back to the council, do we have, Mr. Kennedy, followed by Vice Mayor Wilson.
Mayor, I want to thank you and all of my colleagues who have shared their views about what I believe is an extremely important regulatory scheme related to cannabis. I cannot apologize for my passionate comments and remarks born out of a sense of being Black or brown in America and being mistreated. And all of you, because I respect all of you, understand at least in part, I think, what I am feeling. Staff knows that there's only one council district that would quickly be the recipient of an over concentration of use, and that is District 3. I, as the representative of District 3, am actually supportive in a small context, particularly medical use of marijuana. But regardless of my personal opinion, voters of Pasadena have spoken, the voters of the state have spoken on this subject. And I still maintain that there was work that staff could have done and would not have put us where we are today, trying to subsequently, many months, almost a year later, figure out a regulatory scheme for not more than one cannabis retailer in each district. Staff knows full well what it is recommending, that the more likely than not place where they'll be located is in District 3. As I have advocated and actually got a previous council to approve the distribution of affordable housing throughout the council, I feel similarly with the granting of licensing for cannabis throughout our community. I think that's the only fair thing to do. I would specifically ask my colleagues on EdTech and Councilmember Madison, who is obviously highly respected, and the senior most member of this council has tremendous weight in what he says. Oftentimes I agree, even though we fight occasionally. But in this case, to you, Councilmember Madison, I just think it's unfair for what is being proposed by staff. And remember clearly, my colleagues, staff is suggesting that EdTech unanimously approve some recommendations by EdTech. That's not true. What is true is that staff articulately, vehemently, and strongly made a presentation to EdTech on a pathway forward to solve, no one will discuss it, but some of the litigation, and to get more of the cannabis operators up and running. But as I said in my initial comments, staff has not been ingenuous. They have not shared with the full council that there has been a change in ownership of one of the licensees, because that licensee has sold their company for over $100 million. And as it relates to the money figure that I just mentioned, doesn't it seem a little bit odd that the city manager would prejudge who needs to be an operator in the city of Pasadena, that larger entities are somehow sacrosanct and have greater credibility than a small local operator, irrespective of race, irrespective of diversity? Having a local preference is in fact legal. Race is not. Diversity is. And why? Why can't we arrive at a regulatory scheme that's consistent with where staff, the community, the voters arrived at? We cannot allow the city manager and his team to tell us what to do. We need to vote down this particular matter because it just simply isn't right, Councilmember Rivas. It's not right, Vice Mayor Wilson. It's not right. You wouldn't want something shoved down your throat. I don't either. And to the argument that district boundaries is not the definitive way in which we should look at this, I actually agree. However, I have a district that I represent on the council. We represented to the city council, to the city voters, that there would be no more than one in any one district. What is being proposed today by staff is violative of that. And it's unfair to move away from that particular scheme where there will be, as identified by others, by the map, showing 3 cannabis, possibility of 3 cannabis operators in District 3. And as it relates to the argument, there seems to be all located on Colorado. That's not the only place they can be located. The issue is the availability of rental property that supposedly has been unfound in other districts. The other issue, thirdly, is some of those who have been granted a license from the day in which they were granted the license, but actually before, they got themselves into a pickle because they wrote long-term landlord-tenant relationships, and they want us to fix their business decision. That's not right. That just simply is not right. And I would just simply say, because staff has refused to hear me, that there is no real social equity. When we have an opportunity as a council to act now to provide real social equity to those who have been discriminated against, because Steve Mermel thought that wasn't of value until others apparently have convinced him it's of significant value, we cannot go forward. It's not fair, not in the manner in which staff is recommending. It wasn't EdTech. Staff recommended to EdTech vehemently, strongly, that they move in this direction. And I think it's unfair. And I'm particularly talking to those council members who may be on the fence, not sure. I'm your colleague. However you vote, recognize that I am your colleague and I am not making specious arguments. This is about fairness. This is about equity. This is even about justice. And I know that's hard, but it is.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. One question on the procedural issue. Page raised by Mr. Kennedy, and whose recommendation this is, page 4 of 6 of the report lays out how we got to this point. At one point, the matter came as a question to the council, or was coming to the council, and Mr. Kennedy asked for the matter to be sent to committee, if I recall, or
Mayor, if I may,
asked.
I'm happy to
Why
recount.
don't you go back through, but I think this is an EdTech recommendation is the point, following a process, not the staff's recommendation.
Mayor, you're correct. What's before you, the report before you today is a reflection of EdTech's recommendation. But if I may, just take a few moments, because there's been a lot of conversation about the selection process, social equity, et cetera. I would invite Mr. Kennedy and others to go back during the development phase of our cannabis regulations. And the record is pretty clear on what the city council wanted. It wanted best of breed operators. This was an unknown to us. And the council wanted well-capitalized firms. And I believe if you check the record, you will find scant, if any, discussion by the council of a social equity component. During the development of the request for proposals, we received public input, and members of the public did recommend the inclusion of social equity components, and that was ultimately built into the request for proposals. I do understand that there are people who feel perhaps it didn't go as far as it should. This is an evolving area as it relates to cannabis, but the record is clear. The selection process was not my design, it was the design of the council. It was the council that came up with our incredibly rigorous separation requirements, as well as the one per district restriction. As to how this matter is before the council today, in April 12th to be exact, I did bring forward a recommendation, which is the same recommendation that EdTech is recommending today. Councilmember Kennedy raised some legal questions, so we held that item and it was not presented to the city council on the 12th. And then the matter was rescheduled for the 19th. And in deference to Councilmember Kennedy, I withdrew the item from the agenda and it did not appear on the agenda of the 19th. Subsequent to that, my recollection is that it was Councilmember Hampton that asked about the disposition of the issue. And my recollection, and we can check the record to be sure, is that you, Mayor, directed the item be picked up by the EdTech committee. It was scheduled for EdTech, and that went forward in May, and then there was a meeting in July. And when that came forward at the July 21st meeting, the staff recommendation actually was not the 450 foot distance separation and more than one per council district. It was to go with the state regulations, which would open more opportunities and potentially avoid the concerns that Councilmember Kennedy is articulating today. So that's how it got here. It went to EdTech. After some discussion, my recollection, it was Vice Mayor Wilson that moved, rather than go with the state recommendation, that we go with what had been the staff's original recommendation of 450 feet and more than one or up to three per council district. The matter is now here for the council to dispose of. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, that's helpful on the procedural matters. Councilmember Rivas.
I think Vice Mayor Wilson was.
Oh, I'm
before
sorry.
me.
Yeah, he came out of the queue for some reason. Oh, thank you. Vice Mayor Wilson, followed by Councilmember Rivas.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Mayor. And I'm glad the city manager refreshed everyone's memory that the recommendation to EdTech was to follow the state guidelines, and which would have opened up a lot of spaces throughout the city. And I think that would be, once again, not what we had conveyed to the voters. I would like to say that I have a tremendous amount of respect for Councilmember Kennedy and the issues that he champions in terms of equity and opportunity for everyone in our city. So I put a lot of weight in that. That being said, and I'm like Councilmember Madison, not thrilled that we are putting cannabis operations in our city, but I've come to grips with the fact that we had 20 illegal operators and we've set a regulatory scheme in motion that, cannabis is here, the voters want it. And I'm not convinced that 2 or 3 outlets is sufficient to keep that genie in the bottle. I don't know about you, but I visited some of those illegal operators and they were near schools and libraries. And I think, to me, tremendously distressing in terms of public safety and our kids. So I got on board with a regulatory schema. I'm happy to hear that we continue to keep the genie in the bottle, but I'm concerned if we don't follow through in the voters' desire to have some amount of cannabis retailers in our city, that genie will get out of the bottle. So I feel like we have to have a reasonable number of operators. We set up to 6. We have maybe 2, possibly 3. I don't think that meets our commitment to having enough operators in the city to keep illegal operators at bay. So with the work of the Ed Tech Committee under the chair's leadership, we explored many options. And being mindful of, I think, how sensitive this topic is, or this issue is, we tried to find other ways to kind of cut the strategy so that we wouldn't have 3 in a district, or to keep the separation to 500 feet. And I think after having spent time in committee and with staff, I believe the strategy to allow more than 2 or 3 is the 2 recommendations that Ed Tech Committee made, which was reducing the separation to 450 feet and allowing more than 1 per council district. And, John, the one off Lake, where I think it's Sweet Flower, is literally across the street from my district and 450 feet away from one that's at the Constance Hotel. I'm not thrilled about that. And I visited those locations and I walked them, and I've actually went into a cannabis shop to see what those were like. And I can tell you, having visited illegal operators, those operations are greatly preferable to the alternative. So I'm comfortable with the recommendation to allow this regulatory schema to continue to be successful. I do think we need to allow a few more operators, and I think that's what the voters are expecting of us. John, if there was 1 in District 7, I would take a second one. If that was, we can make that happen. Maybe the redistricting will change that for us, and that will just happen. I do think that the Central District, and if you look at where the zoning code allows these to happen, there were the spaces where they're showing up. That's just the reality of it. So I'm eager to get this behind us. I do think social equity is incredibly important, and I've discouraged the city manager from promoting number 7 to number 6, as I would like to have opportunities to have a social equity component to allow other operators who weren't considered with a social equity lens an opportunity to participate in this new economy of cannabis. So that's my conclusion, and I say that with great deference to John's concerns. But I feel like our obligation is to the citizens of Pasadena, and I feel like this is what we need to do, despite my own reticence. Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor, if I could, if that was a motion by the Vice Mayor, I would second it, and I would also add that I echo all of his comments, and I would add that, if a few of these were moved just a few yards to the south, I'd have multiple licensees in my district, and I'd vote the exact same way for the reasons that I've stated.
If that was a motion, I'd like to add something to it, but if not, then I can make a substitute motion.
We also need to, at some point, close the public hearing.
Let's close the public hearing, and then we'll come back.
Before we close the.
Move to close the public hearing.
Before we close the public hearing, Mayor, I'd like to, if you would allow it, it isn't unusual, that I be able to respond to my colleague in a very deferential and respectful way.
Mr. Kennedy, we'll give you another opportunity, but let's close the public hearing. That doesn't prevent you from responding.
We have a motion.
There's a motion and a second. Next, we'll go to Councilmember Rivas.
There was no second.
I'll second.
Oh,
Thank you, Ms. Councilmember Rivas, sorry. And then should I close it? Should I take the roll call?
yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Hampton,
Yes.
Councilmember Kennedy,
No.
Councilmember Madison,
Yes.
Councilmember Masuda,
Yes.
Councilmember Rivas,
Yes.
Councilmember Williams,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Wilson,
Yes.
Mayor Gordo.
Yes.
The public hearing is closed, 7 in favor, 1 against.
And next, we go to Councilmember Rivas, followed by Mr. Hampton.
Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to thank Councilmember Kennedy for speaking so passionately on the need for a social equity program, which unfortunately is not on the table tonight, but was discussed at EdTech. And just, I believe at the beginning of the public hearing, Councilmember Hampton alluded to possibly bringing that back before the council at 8 months. I may be mistaken, but I believe 8 was the number thrown out. I know at EdTech, the number discussed was 18 months. I would be in favor of being closer to 8 rather than 18. And so I suspect Councilmember Hampton is would like to make a friendly amendment to the motion to introduce a social equity program or bring it back before the council on a shorter time frame, and I would be supportive of that. So I'd turn it over to Councilmember Hampton to speak further on that. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Rivas. That's exactly what I was going to ask for, was to bring social equity back to the council within 8 months.
Okay.
So if that could be added to your motion, I would appreciate that. If that's not a motion right now, then I'll put that motion on the floor, accept staff recommendation with social equity to come back to the council within 8 months.
I'll second that.
And Mr. Madison, do you accept the amendment? Was Mr. Madison there?
Oh, no, it's
Mayor, although it sounds like Mr. Hampton would really like to be the moving member, and I'm fine with that, and the Vice Mayor seconded it.
Okay, got it. Okay, so now we have a substitute motion.
No, I think that was actually the motion.
Yeah, I never actually made a motion.
Oh, I
so,
see.
I was happy to second
got it.
Councilmember Hampton.
Got it. Okay, I'm confusing the two. I apologize. The motion to close the public hearing with the motion on the merits. Okay, so it's been moved by Mr. Hampton and seconded by Vice Mayor Wilson. Before we move on to another round, Mr. Kennedy, I believe Ms. Williams is up next. And then Mr. Kennedy will have an opportunity.
Thank you, Mayor. So I have a lot of concerns about this. I had concerns on the Planning Commission when this was brought to us. It goes back to, we had discussed bringing it to the Rules and Procedures Committee, that we receive these staff reports that say, here is your option. And there's no evaluation of what the various options are. This is what we could do. This is the problem. This is option A, option B, option C, and we are recommending option C for the following reasons. We weren't given any choices here. I do feel like this is kind of being shoved down our throats. I also think it's, as I say, on every land use application, I think this process is backwards. We should be determining how our land use is done based on the needs of the people. Private entities should not be determining our land use for us. We should maintain control over that. This is a fight that we've been fighting with the state for local control. And yet here we are conceding to one private entity that has millions to gain from this, as opposed to listening to our residents. I mean, where's the input of the residents on social equity benefits? Where are the people who've been affected by this, and how are they contributing to this meeting? Where are the voters whose will we are changing tonight for zero public benefit? They're not even at this meeting, and they're going to wake up tomorrow morning to find that we've changed the will of the voters. So I have a lot of concerns about this. Also, the level playing field was brought up in public comment, and changing the rules sort of midstream. I have concerns about that. And I think that we should have a thoughtful program that includes social equity, just given what we know now. This year is different than last year. It's different from when the council originally made these criteria. And I would be supportive of just letting the CUP run out, let this process run out. We end up with 2 or 3 from this first round, close that round, and then we can start over and do another round that actually has real social equity. And several cities have done that. Pomona, El Monte, several other cities have gone through this exact process. And so we're not alone in this. We're members of the COG now, and we can actually talk to them about their best practices. But Pomona banned cannabis, then they opened it up, then they went through another round, and then they're now doing social equity. So we have a chance to actually drive this process so that there are benefits, real benefits, for the members in our community who have been harmed, and not by ownership, but by employment, through job training, through record expungement, even through, there's some really cool ideas in other cities about the employees having ownership and getting a percentage of the revenues of the cannabis. This could really be something that could help our community in a meaningful way. And I don't see any of those changes here. And I'm not going to change the will of the voters for zero public benefit.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. I see it a little bit different, and then we'll let Mr. Kennedy respond. This is an ed tech recommendation. I think it was the right thing to do to send it to a committee of 4 members of the council to review the issues. I go back to why we put regulations in place to begin with. And that was very important for the city to take that step and ensure that we didn't end up with the Wild West like we had at the point in time before we ended up with an ordinance. I was concerned at the time, as those of you who were on the council at the time were, and I suspect every member of the council today was concerned about an ordinance or an initiative being brought forward that would take it out of the city's hands, and then we wouldn't be able to determine our land uses, and that continues to happen in some cities. I mean, El Monte, I wouldn't suggest to you as a shining example. I think there have been some real problems there, legal issues, including for proponents and others. And I like the idea of continuing the distance separations for sensitive uses, and we're stronger than the state. And I think the committee did a good job with that. I think the committee did a good job also shying away from the state law, which is much more permissive than this is. And the yearly review is something that's very important to me and to all of us, because that was put in for a reason. One of the issues that I was concerned about is when you don't have a yearly review, or you issue a conditional use permit that runs with the land, then it's very difficult to take away that conditional use permit when you have someone in that gray area that is maybe not a good operator, but legal findings can't be made by a judge that they are a nuisance. And that's what we found with liquor stores. You'll recall that liquor stores who are grandfathered in, who don't even have a CUP, are regulated by the state. And then when they do have a CUP, we have to make a finding that is a pretty high finding, because that land use entitlement is very valuable. And so the council's hands were tied. And I understand Mr. Kennedy's frustration. Mr. Kennedy, you'll recall that I was very public and boisterous about the liquor store issue and this issue, but I see that we've put in place reasonable regulations. We're not lifting the citywide cap of 6. And I do think there's distance separation from the central district or not central district, from the Playhouse district area and Old Pasadena. So, and we'll see what happens in redistricting and what that brings us. So for those reasons, and because I don't think we're out of the woods in terms of an initiative. If we don't act to meet the voters' intent, as Ms. Williams puts it, of providing access, then we may end up with an initiative that has merit, because we've learned quite a bit since we adopted the ordinance or suggested it to the voters. You know, I hear from people all the time, well, what happened? How come we're not seeing it? And my biggest concern is that we don't have reasonable regulations in place, that we have an initiative that opens up the Wild West in District 3 or any part of the city. And that would be very problematic for me, and I suspect for all of us. And so I view this as very much meeting the voters' intent, ensuring we have reasonable regulations and distance requirements in place protecting neighborhoods and sensitive uses, but at the same time, ensuring that, you know, we have the high ground, so to speak, no pun intended, of course. If someone were to accuse us of not of artificially restricting the will of the voters when they said they wanted access, and then we end up with another initiative proposal, that would be, I think, a disaster for the city and for all of your councilmatic districts. So I'm prepared to support it. I understand, Mr. Kennedy, your concerns, and you know, you're right to make your voice heard. You have. I think the social equity component is a good suggestion by you and by Ms. Williams, and it's included in the motion, and I support that. Now, you know, we're going to have that discussion and define what social equity means, and that too is going to have an impact on locations. And so I am going to be watching that very carefully as EdTech and staff work together to define what social equity means and what impacts are brought in terms of changes to the ordinance. But I do support looking at the issue very carefully and doing it expeditiously. Mr. Kennedy?
Thank you, Mayor. As it relates to social equity, there's SB 1294, the California Cannabis Equity Act, that was offered by one of my former colleagues at Southern California Edison, who's now in the state Senate, Mr. Bradford. And that was February 21, 2020. Not sure when it was signed into law. That should be one guide that certainly the City Council of Pasadena could use. As it relates to, you know, one of my colleagues who I consider a math guy and a tech guy, as presented, this agenda report would allow 1/2 of all the cannabis retailers to be in District 3. Can't get around that. There's no way to slice the pie differently. It's 1/2 in District 3. In our previous consideration of this matter as a council, we had moved in the direction, at least some of us, that we would wait until after redistricting to take up this matter. I believe that there are forces that want us to move much faster than I think is prudent. But in order to do that, meaning to move slower, we need to defeat the agenda report tonight. And at one point, I was encouraged that that may occur. I'm less encouraged at this juncture in the discussion. I have, in my view, done everything that I thought was ethical, representative of my district, bigger than my district, representative of what the voters had said and what we represented to the voters, which was no more one cannabis retailer in each district. That is not what we're doing tonight. That is not what the motion reflects. Motion reflects a direct violation of what we represented to the voters. And frankly, if this matter isn't voted down, I would be extremely disappointed. I will have known that democracy worked, where my colleagues allowed me to be heard, and I have been respectful intentionally of all the comments from the mayor and each one of my colleagues, because I hope that you feel as passionately about what we've discussed as I do. I want to thank all of you for hearing me, even if I have not convinced you to vote no on the matter before you. You're penalizing my district, and we have an opportunity to do this the right way. I think Councilmember Felicia Williams has experience in the area, being a former commissioner, planning commissioner, in her own business related to land use. And for some reason, we're not listening to her. And I think that she deserves to be listened to. And her arguments have been extremely sound. Again, Mayor, I want to thank you for the opportunity to address this matter in this meeting on several occasions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. And we appreciate, of course, the issues and the passion. One of just a brief response. One, one thing that I'd like to highlight, as a council, we're called upon to exercise our best judgment and protect our constituents in the city. And, as I look at the possibility of an initiative, that weighs heavily on me. And I think we've got to do the right thing in this situation, guard against that, and still meet the will of the voters. And I think the motion that's before us is poised to get us to that point. The social equity issue then can come back expeditiously and we can have that discussion. But thank you. Okay, I think that exhausts.
Mayor, I do want to remind, especially our newer council members, how hard our police department, code enforcement, attorney's office worked to get a handle on what was kind of the Wild West of 20 illegal operators. And I think I like to believe that by having a reasonable approach to providing kind of a product that I'm not a fan of, but to those who want it and those who've spoken, is a way to continue to have that balance and protect our community. It's risk is involved in closing down illegal operators. We did have competing ballot initiatives that would have been, I think, not in the best interest of the city. So Mayor, I agree with your assessment that this is the right, but it's a difficult balance. And once again, I think John makes an incredibly strong case. But when I put all this on the scales, I think moving forward and proceeding with Councilmember Hampton's motion, which I support, is in the best interest of the city.
Yeah, and yeah, some of us paid personally the price of when this was the Wild West in Pasadena, we had 20 operators, and that was a very difficult time for all of us, for me personally. But but I think even some of the the operators who were operating unlawfully would say that, you know, it was a mistake on their part, and regulation does make sense. But, you know, we just have to we continue to adjust as things evolve, as we learn more about not just cannabis, but the operations, including retail sales. But, you know, I do think that this proposal from EdTech is a reasonable one.
Roll call vote.
Roll call vote?
To approve the staff recommendation amended to bring back the social equity issue back to the city council within 8 months. Councilmember Hampton,
Yes.
Councilmember Kennedy,
As the young people say, all around the country, hail to the no. Thank you.
Councilmember Madison,
Yes.
Councilmember Masuda.
No.
No. Councilmember Rivas,
Yes.
Councilmember Williams,
No.
Vice Mayor Wilson. Vice Mayor Wilson, sorry, I think you muted.
Sorry, that was yes.
Yes. Mayor Gordo.
Yes.
Motion is approved, 5 in favor, 3 against.
Okay, that brings us to, thank you everyone for your comments and insight, and thank you to the committee for reviewing this matter carefully and bringing us a proposal. Next, we have